Hello everyone, today we talk about the Danubian Bulgar army organization. In other words, this is about the armies of the First Bulgarian Empire, but also of the previous era, before the settlement in the Balkans or in the first generations, and in part, as we've seen in our Eurasian steppes warfare videos, like the same, pretty similar, Eurasia among nomads normally based on a decimal system, etc. We'll see now many names, terminologies were shared. In fact, these other populations that gravitated around, especially the Pontic steppe, right? And that in the case of the Bulgars, albeit we never made a video specifically on that, corresponded to a diaspora, or at least a different settlement. Part of the Bulgars settled on the Danube. In fact, these were the ones that would territorialize more successfully into the First Bulgarian Empire. Then you had other Bulgar groups that were absorbed by other peoples, such as the Avars, the Khazars. Then you have the Volga Bulgars, about whose warfare I made a video between, however, the 14th century. Today we stick essentially to the High Middle Ages. We do not talk about the Second Bulgarian Empire. In any case, you know that I made videos about both periods, both empires. This is more about the migration era, the early Middle Ages, and the end of the First Empire, crushed essentially as a policy institutionally by Basil II, made some reference to the Bulgars also, in fact, in those Byzantine history videos. And of course, there is a lot of intersections, especially towards the end, between the Byzantine and the Bulgarian, right? Not Bulgar anymore at that point, but also from an early date, and the Imperial Army, right? The Byzantine army organization. I also made a video about the Bulgars among the various auxiliaries of the Byzantine army as well, that talked about this topic, in fact. But today we just look at the other side, properly at the Bulgar polity and how it was formed. Bear in mind, this is just about their army organization, so everything concerning tactics, armament, we still have to cover. I made some Bulgarian Byzantine battles videos. We already dealt with the Bulgars in the Eurasian steppes series. We talk specifically about them at some point, their equipment, right? But today we stick mostly to the army organization, that of course is a political and social product, and as such, of course, illustrates other characteristics, some specifics of the Bulgars as a people and the way they had come, in fact, we'll see now, to especially to territorialize. There is the Great Fence, for example, is a very sort of overlooked topic. Everybody knows about Offa's Dyke or the Danevirke, but the Arcasia is not really one of the most familiar things you hear of, but we will talk about it in the end, right? And admittedly, we do not know too much about the Danubian Bulgarian army organization. We have these titles, these officials that we see just in general history. Just think about the recent video about the early medieval Serbian principality and the various ravages carried out by Simeon the Great's army's commanders. And naturally, what fascinates the most about these titles is of how they resonate within a broader Turco-Mongolian, but also Iranian at some point, military culture, lexicon. The etymologies are often and very hotly disputed because, of course, we are not even entirely sure at some point about these people's intersections, intertwinement, and what was actually used at the time as a normal term, right? About the organics properly, we know really less, right? We have this, again, general decimal understanding, but the details are otherwise scanning. And there is a reason, though, and that gets down to the level of development of these peoples, how they were, in fact, organized, how they levied, how they used to, to be mobilized, armed, etc. And so even that absence actually is quite telling about certain ways of war that were quite traditional in that, in spite of the passage from the Turkic Bulgar to de facto the Slavic Bulgarian identity, is sort of owed a lot, in fact, to a migration era background, right? It's something we observed. In fact, in the same video about the First Bulgarian Empire, we'll see now better. So, the origins of the Bulgars are complex. They deserve another video. I will start a series about, say, at least Western Eurasian steppe peoples at some point soon. In any case, the origin of this people is the Onagers, right? This population appears essentially after the disgregation, in parallel with chronologically, the disgregation of the Hunnic Empire that had collapsed, as you know, after this decisive defeat, apparently, at the hands of the same Hunnic Germanic subjects at the Battle of Nedau in 454. We do not even know where this Nedau is located precisely, but seemingly it struck the Hunnic heartland, or at least what had become the one of their empire in the Carpathian basin, the Pannonian plain. And there is a lot of stuff going on there just in the Germanic tradition. And this battle is quite momentous because it sort of shows what basically I point out all the time in this channel, how, in many ways overrated the Huns were from one side, but also in this sense how stronger was sedentary civilization, actually even just a semi-nomadic one of the Germans at this point in Central Europe, in the medium long-term picture. Like the Huns could have never handled by culture a sedentary civilization. I mean, the Germans managed to do so in the lands of the Roman Empire. The Huns were sort of destined to crumble, and they did it more speedily even than these other populations that would succeed themselves in the area. At least those who prevalently stuck to a nomadic lifestyle. Think about the Avars, right? So there is, as we've seen in the video about the Eurasian steppes warfare, a literal evolution of steppes cultures, actually, and comparatively to civilization, an involution of some sort, right? The decline of the Iranians brings to the arrival of the Turks that, however, are sort of more spent force that sort of ends earlier than what the Iranian dominance had lasted. The same can be said about the Mongols. Like, you have these sort of ever more violent, outbursts that, however, also quite lead to an equally fast demise. That's all, again, a leitmotif that you can find. It's very, I don't know, it's a general take, but systemically, I think it is correct in the bigger picture. I made many videos about Eurasian steppes warfare that I created a playlist about that. So if you're curious, it stems as a counter-alter to the general defeatism that kicked in at some point in Western civilization. Speaking of, oh my God, there are other peoples out there that are sort of different from us, and that we can't think like in frame anymore, because of course people have gotten increasingly ignorant, or at least those who taught and learned in the past were proportionally much better educated than those who do it today, and the confidence that actually these peoples of the steppes were, yes, they were terrible, they were warlike, they were destructive and dangerous, whatever, but that at the end of the day crushed against the the rock of civilization that the West prevailed historically to an enormous extent. This is a narrative that for many reasons, not just defeatism, but very often self-hatred, especially from the side of the fourth estate, is continuously, at least it's something that it's winked at till today, especially in the lower classes. And in many ways, when you look at, I greatly estimate these steppes peoples. One of my favorite lines is that I learned from my mentor many years ago is never commit the childish mistake of thinking to be more intelligent or more capable than a 7th century Bulgar horseman. And I couldn't subscribe enough to this. These people were really clever. They were really smart. They were living in constant danger, peril, threat. Their ethnogenesis, their political cohesion rested on this militarism, this imperialism. That's something which left specific steppes marks in Eastern Europe, for that matter, especially after the Mongol conquest. But in case of the Bulgars, you see, of course, that there is a heavy Slavization and Byzantinization of their culture. And that this, of course, enters a bit like in the same pattern of what happened to the Magyars, for example, after the Battle of Lackfield. And the fact that we tend to underestimate how connected these nomadic peoples were in origin to and revolving around just by instinct of survival the greater civilizations. For example, it's notorious in Magyar warfare that the connections with Persia, the Middle East, were extremely strong, right? Hungary would maintain that to the Black Sea, lower Danubian branch of the Silk Road for centuries after. We've seen it in the video about Hungarian warfare, many, probably also in material culture, in arms and armor, etc. With the Bulgars, it's slightly different. We know less about their origin. The name, first of all, speaking of the Onagers, that are not actually connected with the collapse of the Hunnic Empire, but say I began with that because, as we'll see now, the power dynamics brought eventually to new gaps to be filled by other people. But the same etymologies of these populations names are sometimes disputed, right? The name Onager is widely thought, at least to derive from Onger, that is to say the 10 Ogur tribes, right? And what is fascinating, I would say, is the etymology of Ogur, that is Turkic in origin, and it has a, this is disputed, it's either like an arrow, right? It's just like Genghis Khan's legend of the bundle. It's like the Roman fasces, right? If you, a single horseman alone is nothing, but if you bundle them together, like you can't quite break them, just like you can't break the arrow so easily, even though it's just a bunch of them. And that at the same time sort of means tribe, clan from August, and that sort of matches, and it shows also how say symbolically different, especially among the Turco-Mongol peoples, for example, the relevance of weapons really was. The bow and the arrow were essentially what the sword could be in the West, but even, say, in times of the Iranian dominance of the steppes, and that's also a very underrated concept. Like the passage from Iranian to Turkic-dominated steppes is something, that I would insist much more in the nature of collapse, also from just the Turkic side. Who were the Turks and why they came up? And I made many videos about this in the Eurasian Steppes series. The generic Onagur, by the way, is considered to be the same etymology of Hungary. All right. So this, we don't have, again, time to digress on the ethnogenesis of these peoples, but regarding what we were just saying regarding the Iranian dominance of the steppes before the Turkic waves, is that, of course, many Bulgars themselves were actually descending from Iranians. In fact, when you look at stales from the first generations of the Bulgar settlement on the Danube, you actually find, yes, that the prevalence is Turkic, but there is a substantial amount of Indo-European script on these monuments. So the question is, of course, how much of the military cultures involved here had also blended together from previous times. Admittedly, of course, their warfare was not so wildly different, but even regarding the collapse of the Mongol Empire, before we do know that there were chunks, for example, of Huns that sort of flew away, that sort of kept even just existing, especially east of the Carpathians, and that sort of came back from the way they had arrived. They were still, we know it, ethnotropologically from the 18th century, still groups of Germanized peoples in countries like Crimea and further, and those had come probably from Central, from Northern Europe back in the day. But all those, enormously spread and also populous Iranians of the previous millennia that had in fact dominated an enormous amount of space and very far east, right, to the point of interfering, in fact, with the same originary ethnogenesis of some, even in fact, Turco-Mongol peoples. Some people say that even China was founded by Indo-Europeans dynastically, and it's actually and perfectly plausible, right? Is of course could have not been washed away, could have not been exhausted, eliminated. The steppes. That's what I was saying before. When we think about the migration era, we think that the barbarians came and destroyed, and everything was rebuilt from scratch. Absolutely not. This is, of course, quite self-evident in sedentary Europe that always had the upper hand over anyone that, arrived culturally, civilizationally. But the situation was not particularly positive at all for all the people who were from the other side that actually were moving just because of the disastrous situations in which they found themselves just habitually and searching for stability, which basically it was the thing it could not really get, and that had brought them to just live at the outskirts of civilization up to that point, and with a great at this point, during all these wars, movements, demographic exhaustion, incredible material poverty, and more. So we know how hard that was, from the military history, banally, of a sedentary world, of Europe, the Mediterranean. You can imagine in the steppes. In fact, what actually makes this military history fascinating is the degree of sort of more moral reboosting, right, that these peoples had in a broader sense. The models that they reinjected. Think about all the Iranians that fled west. We talk about it so frequently, but with the islands, with generally speaking, the influence that the Iranian populations had, especially in Latin, the development of further fostering of Latin Germanic chivalry, was something present already at the core of the Indo-European origin of those and values of those peoples, but that the migration era reinjected. Just when was it? Yesterday, the other day, I made a video about the Byzantine whole half-armored horse, and how a good complement for the knight's panoply was, by that second half of the 6th century, also the hard metal stirrup imported by the Avars, not much through the Sasanian medium, right? And in fact, most of these injections and most of the attrition that also helped, right, conflict helped, right, reactivating even certain specific bases of Western civilization during early medieval times, passed through the movements of these populations through the Eurasian steppe band, like longitudinally developing. And this is self-evident from, I don't know, think about Alemannic or Longobardic or Gothic, Austro-Gothic especially, lamellar armor, that in fact is something where you find identically from the gates of Germany and Italy up to the Bering Strait, right? So this is not much, because those designs survived through the millennium. To last century, we have literally pictures of peoples from the northeast of Asia, like literally having still that armor, right? And again, I made a video about Tibetan warfare that illustrates that also quite remarkably, I think, from the beautiful pictures that I used that are present, fortunately, about those kind of armor, that you have difficulties to even date, because essentially the design remained pretty much the same throughout the ages. So this alone, who cares where they were made? What matters, a historical datum, is that, in fact, you can't distinguish them. It's a far more important macroscopic, hard, concrete evidence than speaking of the nature of that warfare, rather than knowing when that piece of material was arranged in that way, which is just what a deterministic, materialistic, relativistic mind, so quite a mature one for history in the first place, can wander in up to a certain level of relevance. Now, speaking of the Onogurs, these had, together with the Kutrugur and Utugur Hans, become subjects of the Avars in the mid-6th century. Right, this was another population that originated pretty far east, right, between Central and Eastern Asia, and that brought with it, in fact, also a lot of military inputs from China. Think about the Sino-Avar mangonel. The same Magyars would arrive later with remarkable polyurcetic capacities, evidently taken at that time from Persia, the Arab world, which is actually at the time where most siege engineers in China came from as well, across Asia. And the etymology of Kutrugur Utugur is sort of simpler. It's basically about the 9 tribes and the 30 tribes, respectively. In any case, you see how these peoples coalesce on the basis of their, of also the type of dominion that they are part of, right? The Avars are arising as the major force in the area in fact, in mid-6th century. They would also move west and settle, in fact, in the Carpathian basin, from which they coalesced after a time of relative division. Like, everybody thinks that the Avars were strong because, I don't know, they had that specific type of technologies or whatever. Yes, they were much more impressive than the Huns in many ways, but first and foremost, there's nothing deterministic about that. What really changes the game for the Avars is the coalescence in the Carpathian Basin under a Kagan, right? Because the ones of the first generation were, useful, for example, for the Longobards to crush the Gepids, but they were not the might to be reckoned with that would coalesce in a couple of generations, would be able to besiege Constantinople, mobilizing the Slavs around. Shepherds of peoples, these peoples are called like this. The Bulgars do fit this, as they would themselves. You see, these were the great steppes overlords. They had an incredibly brutal, violent, and traumatic model of leadership. They were objectively savages. I mean, there is no other way of putting that, not in the sense that they were incapable, just they were bloodthirsty and destructive to an extreme extent whenever they, of course, needed to capitalize upon raiding, right? And they knew how to be obeyed when they needed instead to subject populations, deporting them, repopulating other areas. And the Slavs especially are quite instrumental to this. The great part of the Slavic migrations was actually proceeding in the wake, at least, of the Avar one. And there is a specific type of military integration between these peoples and the Avars, because the nomads are here the fresh, primitive, incredibly authoritarian force, whereas the Slavs were just sort of the last comers of the migration here. They came out of the Pripyat marshes when everybody around had abandoned it, largely the other territories, and they were incredibly poor and sort of fragmented, so they mostly were based on infantry, and also scarcely equipped one. We talk about all these various peoples from Maurice Pseudo-Maurice, strategic and great description. There's really nothing wrong to say this, right? This is not to say that, of course, if the Slavs had heavy cavalry, as any people in Europe had, this means that still they weren't overwhelmingly infantry-based, and they were particularly backwards and poor, but still smart, right? If you read again what the Byzantine description of the Slavic settlements, how they were strategically designed to bail out in case of imperial raids, and how they were effective in counter, let's say in guerrilla warfare, essentially. You understand that that's history, and you can appreciate them. Where like that, I often get in this videos, like at least I had in the past, very scarcely and sparsely, because I get an incredibly low amount of criticism. But if it has to be, no, the Slavs had, I don't know, they had their weapons all standardized, we're just like any other. And you can't avoid to feel, at least from the subject, I don't care where these guys come from, but from these individuals, like the moral, the desperation behind the statement, meaning like we know how things fundamentally were. I mean, there is a comparative history that definitely you cannot understand if you think that the only thing that matters in the world is just your piece of dirt that you call a country, completely ignoring the imperial Catholic tradition and divine transcendence, which is actually what these peoples believed in, above anything else. And you, of course, cannot afford to evaluate, to quantitatively, critically, and qualitatively appreciate the differences in peoples, warfare and society in Europe, in whichever other place at the time. I mean, it's cool to talk history about these things, but we're not here making the good little mankins that have to pretend that since most people are radically underschooled in anything historical, they can't afford to spread just inconsistencies because they feel neglected or mistreated or whatever. That's a cultural problem, right, that you have to resolve. That's not something that I can do for you. And overwhelmingly, I have actually lots of Slavic followers, the wide majority of them that are actually great, some of which are my friends and contribute to the channel marvelously and have always appreciated the way I narrate these things, even brutally, but still to the way that I came to assess. Now, the what we're talking about is, of course, the Avars moving into the Carpathian Basin and fundamentally leaving part of the Pontic steppe, that over which they still had actually as the major regional force before in the same, and then again in Central Europe, some control, some military presence. That's an incredibly fascinating frontier, for example, that is quite overlooked. I would like to make a video about that. And what happens is that these other populations that are subjected to the Avars and that are left behind at their passage begin to rise, and exploiting, of course, what was happening in the Sanitary War. For example, the decline of Avar power itself after 626. That is the failed, in fact, Avar Persian siege of Constantinople, which brought the Bulgars to secede from this broader Avar system, dominion, in 638. Right. Then, once independent, these onagers adopted properly the name Bulgar, which is literally a term seemingly used to define troublemakers. This is what that means, right? Somebody who rebels, somebody who sort of leaves at the outskirts, brings chaos, right? Which was a very identitary point of the same Turks to a broader extent, because this had again remained confined in sort of the ghetto of the same steppes, right, in the Far East, and at some point they boomed, and so we were the ones who were the underdogs, right, and we managed to to bring havoc instead and rising, being terrible, but still also reaffirming a power on our own, right? And this is a fitting context because imagine the Carpathian Basin, and then from the Danubian, this lower Danube Valley, you have the steppe corridor starts there, arrives in basically in Ukraine, and then goes further. Well, that's the location of these Turkic peoples, but many other fragmented ones that had, as we've seen, also parts of the Huns that being rejected from Europe and that have sort of stuck around and were in relation with the Byzantines, and were often complaining, in fact, in front of the Saint Constantinople because it's asking for protection, being co-opted as mercenaries, etc., because of this continuous traffic of peoples that now is still keeping to pour from the east, even though the Avars for a while were the last big wave. Then the Bulgars in this case in part enter, in fact, the Balkans. And the term Bulgar, by the way, appears as early as 482. These were not the same people necessarily. I mean, surely some of them actually were, but as we've seen, it's like with onager, it's a generic term of some sort, and there were sort of multiple Bulgars that, in fact, also took different paths, as we were recalling with Volga, Bulgaria, etc. So around the mid-7th century, many of these Bulgar tribes were yet to fully coalesce, in fact, some more stable system, to the point that they were subjected by yet another Turkic people that were the Khazars, that, as you know, established in Eastern Europe a major domain, essentially also managing to territorialize to an important degree by nomadic standards in the High Middle Ages. And this, I'm making the thing very simple, but again, we'll make other videos about this. This Khazar wave brought the Bulgars to escape into different directions, some of which were also to essentially to be a dead end, and that instead, in the best case, was the Danubian direction, where the Bulgars managed to settle and remain independent, and also forming essentially one of the greatest powers in Europe at the time, essentially an alter ego of the Byzantine Empire, at least in the intentions. The Byzantines remain in their essentially Aegean, Greek, urbanized reality. The Bulgars, later the Bulgarians, remain instead the continental, rural, Slavic reality. But they compenetrated each other, and there was surely a potential for cooperation, which is definitely what you see at some point with the conversion to Christianity. Naturally, the early Bulgars were pagans as the Slavs. Different beliefs, systems, albeit part, of course, of the same universal tradition. It's a bit the same potential that existed with the Rus at some point. We're also quite close to these peoples, the Bulgars, the Khazars. So a true melting pot as far as, for example, the military culture is involved. Sometimes you can't even distinguish these people. Like, what is this, for example? It's our, like, let's say, a weapon, an engraving. Is it Bulgar? Is it Magyar? What the hell is this, right? Where does it come from? Like, you can't quite even answer it that easily, all right? It's the famous Nagis Zentlikos medallion, for example, that the origins are disputed, because these peoples were in many ways all like, the source depicts a beautiful horseman, like, dragging essentially a prisoner, taking it from the hair, and there is also a severed head attached to his saddle in the process, which literally gives you the dimension of probably of the moral values of these people, right? These people were made to rule over others, and exterminating any sort of resistance, and it was just ingrained in the deepest vein of their culture. It was these peoples again had come out traumatized from that nightmarish experience that the steppe is, and they haven't, to an extent, like in their ancestry, ever known anything different, or at least that they know there is something different. Is these, after all, fertile lands in the Balkans by steppe standards, where they can graft themselves on a effective sanitary dimension. They can start a political territorial government and more, still essentially terrorizing their neighbors, threatening them, like blackmailing them, get tribute against instead of retaliation, distractions, etc. And that gradually, throughout this period between the 7th and 11th century, settled down, changed, and received, in fact, an enormous influence from the Byzantines, that again convert them, are just close to them, to the extent, of course, that part of the Bulgarian dominion was still considered as part of the Roman Empire, right? And the Bulgarian rulers would elevate themselves to the imperial authority, even though not the Roman one, because for them it was Roman. For the Byzantines, of course, that could have never been recognized anyway. And so there is this epochal change there in their history. An important aspect of Bulgar history on the Danube is that the people get largely Slavicized already by the end of the 7th century. So in the first generations after the settlement, this is very typical of the migration era in probably sanitary realities. We see it in the West as well with the Germans. And in the case of the Balkans, however, the nature of this people is a bit wilder, right? They truly are nomadic peoples that, yes, had been around for centuries. They knew what the outer world really was. They knew the Roman Empire. They had served into the imperial army. But they fundamentally had been living out there in the steppes. And it's rather the fact that the Slavs themselves have maintained to some point a degree of, not really of semi-nomadic lifestyle, but they were quite up to raids, to incursions. They also, just by in peacetime, they would practice transhumance, not just agriculture. There were also lots of other peoples that, of course, had pre-existed those areas. The same idea that the Slavs simply arrived and sort of redrew the ethnic picture of the Balkans. It's of course incorrect historically, but it's the culture that matters. It's how this new identity kicks in and how it blends with other, with what really the migration era had been about. It was essentially an uprising to some extent to the greater Catholic Empire, and so just like the Bulgars within the steppes were the scoundrels of the situation, again the troublemakers, compared to the great Khaganates, right, that ruled imperially and universally over enormous swaths of the steppes. Here a bit the sense that the Slavs had always been sort of harassing the Roman Empire, but also settling into it and sort of merging, and yet being always in this sort of unreachable, or at least indirectly controllable Balkan hinterland, extremely effective at guerrilla ambushes, raids, is something that the Bulgars take to a next level, right? Just like the Avars had done. Like, I mean, how do you besiege Constantinople if you're merely like a nomadic people? The answer is the Slavs. The Slavs contribute with these large numbers of infantrymen that work a bit as as field aides, as pioneers, as logists of some sort, with their, of course, relatively primitive ways. But of course, this nomadic conquerors were bringing with them a massive technical expertise. I mean, just as we were saying before, like if you're an average Bulgar horseman, you have to know how to exploit terrain. You have to be able to survive in the wilderness. You have to orient yourself. You have to maintain this connection. You must have an incredible athletic, sort of background. You must leave your life outside and cattle raiding and passing to the sport wherever it's needed. But the bulk, the mass, like what eventually this elite, this mounted elite, floats on, is largely brought by supported by the Slavs at large. That also have, again, the same exact things. They do have their elite, they have the nobility. That, of course, is co-opted by the same Bulgars, but that, especially at the beginning, is considered just like as the subject, and something, in fact, that the Bulgars had literally conquered and subjected to their, again, incredibly. You don't want to enter in the mindset of a Bulgar cat, right? Of the 7th century, right? It's too dangerous. But fortunately, we can't either. But again, this something I often say about these peoples: you shouldn't be searching for too much human sensitivity or things like human mercy from an average Bulgar horseman. That's something that probably is intimately alien to his culture, right? The sole purpose of these people is slaughtering enormous amounts of enemies and killing and raping and subjecting and dominating and lording over and being maintained. This is the mindset where you come from. And of course, they're clever, right? They know how to do this, and I would think that the First Bulgarian Empire is a testament to the degree of pragmatism and, again, intelligence and capacity that the Bulgars had to cooperate with the Slavic locals that eventually contributed greatly to their fortune. All right. So, as early as 705, when Khan Tervel of Bulgaria sent a large army to assist the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, Slavic elements constituted a remarkable proportion of the Bulgar army, right? And this had surely began since the first settlement. I mean, you do not really need to consider a Slav or any other subject as a freeman, for example, in order to elevate him to the rights of a levy system. This would take shape over time under the Bulgarian administration of what was emerging as a state, imitating the same Byzantine cities and and officials and so on. It's more correct to see that there was a hierarchy. There was an ethnic and social certification for which, of course, those who were under had to obey and who cared. Like, if you armed them, it was technically divine glory that was giving you the power to arm others that followed you, and that you had to be powerful enough to be able to tame and to transfigure to bring to your higher level. On that occasion of Khan Tervel, we know that in the Bulgar army there was 15,000 Bulgar horsemen, which likely also was the maximum potential that Khan Tervel could mobilize in the first place. These peoples were, it's relatively early in time here, so there is still a on horseback lifestyle, or at least readiness for the entire Bulgar people to some extent. That's also an important passage in terms of how these peoples began mostly sedentaries, and so it's also abandoning great part of that equestrian capability that had characterized them. All nomadic peoples, aside from their fortune in this transition, would in fact abandon that immediate level of mounted lifestyle, right? Even though in the case of the Bulgars, we have to remember that they were, and the Bulgarians in general later, were located exactly in the most trafficked corridor of the steppes. I mean, all the nomads that had invaded Europe had basically passed mostly through the Danubian Valley. Yes, some had gone through the Carpathians, had done some interesting roundabouts, but fundamentally that was the most highly trafficked highway for it had always been, right, for the nomads to enter Europe, which means that given that, of course, out there in the steppes there were lots of other peoples that in fact at time were weaponized, especially by the Byzantines against the Bulgars to relieve pressure on the Danubian frontier. There was a considerable degree of proximity to steppes lifestyle, right? And we've seen it throughout all sort of Eastern Balkan history. The First Bulgarian Empire was essentially the only real state that developed, in fact, in the Eastern Balkans historically. The second one was important as well, but it was also the fruit of different sort of ethnic compounds, Bulgarians, Vlachs, Cumans, even so. It's a bit of a different situation. It's also a heavily feudalized system, at least compared to what it had been before. There's a lot of Latin influence at that point because of the, of the Fourth Crusade, and of course a lot of Byzantine ones still, right? And after the Byzantines had destroyed essentially that people back in at least that polity back in the day, so to some extent, what you see in the First Bulgarian Empire is the closest to some sort of, more compact military, statally wise, that Bulgaria would have in medieval times. But we're talking also about early, say, primitive times, the High Middle Ages. All right, so that sense still that the main Bulgarian force was mounted is something that continues even just by practicality among the fact that now fundamentally Slavic state, right? The Bulgarian rulers were wielding definitely an enormous power, but their nobility, their aristocracy was always very autonomous in many ways, and very often they couldn't quite control it because they controlled an enormous territory, but it was not directly controlled everywhere. It was mostly decentralized. There were all these different clans with their aristocracies, with their horsemen that sort of would take the advantage of any, Byzantine weakness, for example, to ride down the Aegean valleys, for example. And it's basically all what happens in Balkan medieval history. Like literally nothing else happens except this continuous raids through these valleys that also definitely doesn't help in stabilizing the territory in a more political sense, but also forges these fascinating military hybrids and culture. Right? Surely there were lots, and surely more than 15,000 infantry to support the Terbil's cavalry, right? And we can think actually a similar ratio, maybe exactly that, 30,000 men, which is also like the maximum that at this point, as we will see later, the same Bulgarian armies could reach, but really by early medieval standards, really this is the case for pretty much any power. And this shows you like the maximum effort, again, a full commitment and mobilization of the Bulgars at the end of at the beginning of the 8th century. And there is also no doubt that even though the Bulgar element was always central, that the Slavic component was equal and or majoritary basically throughout all the history of the First Bulgarian Empire, right? The same Slavic aristocracies were co-opted. This was totally normal. If you look at Slavic arms and armor, we'll talk about this better in some dedicated video, especially the historical military unit kind. We're always sort of getting their panoplies from these peoples in model, right? They could be, if they were more like in the west, they would take it, say, from the Carolingians, from the Franks, but always from the greater power. And so, I don't know, a Slavic chieftain that stayed under the Avars would have apparently an Avar-looking equipment. Again, there was an important degree of decentralization and also width of these dominions. So especially in the Avar case, as also later Hungarian military history proves, for example, in areas like, I don't know, Slovakia, you would have a Frankish, a Western influence in equipment, more than the other that was present. But for the Bulgars, right, from a Slav living, say, in fact, in the Eastern Balkans, it would be mostly, in fact, Bulgar or Byzantine in nature. And in fact, this was the relation. Also, the Byzantines were the stronger ones, and the Bulgars mostly drew from them. Right, it was a way to aggrandize themselves, to be co-opted by this broader system, even though being competitive and in conflict with it. And overall, you have a great deal of fostering of Slavic chieftains in the Bulgar semi-nomadic lifestyle, or at least this predatory raiding one that ends up to become the norm in the area, in spite of course, of the sedentarization. These are become sedentary armies. You can't look at the 11th century Bulgarian army and say, oh my god, these are semi-nomad. No, right? They, as much as we were saying before, they, in a couple of generations, the Bulgars mixed with the Slavs, they sort of took on that sedentary warfare as well. Of course, there was a lot in terms of Bulgar identity connected with the steppe, with that autocratic model. The nobility was on horseback. This is all something you find everywhere. You find it among the Magyars. You find them like even in the West, like even peoples like the Longobards or the Visigoths that had largely gentrified themselves in southern Europe. They were representing themselves and also were represented by others like the Franks, but as fundamentally as horsemen, right? Even though maybe the Carolingians had already surpassed them, albeit in a new way, like probably in a Western sedentary way, whereas still the Longobards, the Goths, as you know, had maintained that migration era bias originally. I made a video about the making of Carolingian cavalry that explains this, and also we talk a lot about Longobard. A bit less about Gothic warfare, but we have to compensate for that. Just, of course, the Goths were around for less time than the Franks or the Longobards, so we know less about them. And there was general tendency, of course, to consider the Bulgar stock as superior to some cultural, ethnic, and social degree, which, militarily speaking, was mirrored by the frequent eventuality of the Slavic levies being officered by Bulgars. This is absolutely normal if you, of course, realize the ratios we're talking before. The Slavs were much less stratified than the Bulgars. They were largely peasants, and when the Bulgars came around, of course, the majority of them were sort of the equivalent of that, of this light, basically unarmored horse archers that were led by what within the same Bulgars were considered like a superior race, but the major military clans who controlled the territory, so the majority of the Slavic population were entrusted by the Khan and just by tradition to organize the local military. So not just their military clans, but also these subjects, right? And so exploiting them and ordering them and teaching them from their sort of more militaristic steppe mentality how they had to fight, how they had to be put together, this is not strictly related, but I made a video that sort of fits because it's sort of about Western late medieval warfare, but it goes like on the constant constant nightly awareness of infantry potential. As you know, my channel is incredibly loud about the most obvious denial of and refusal, especially of the idea that the infantry sort of at some point fooled cavalry, and that the the victories of the footmen. They weren't victory. I mean, they were of the footmen not because they were commoners. They were actually still men at arms of the 100 Years' War. Were because there was some stupid French knight who was too much of a nobleman to care about the infantry. It is radically and completely one of the most stupid, historically false ideas that have been being propagated by modernistic nonsense regarding common people literally having an understanding of politics or military training or whatever, and just for a bunch of battles that didn't really change the essence of Wu-led war, which was always the nobility, even when they began to train infantry, like with pike squares, etc., of people that were subjected to them at that point, so completely alien to any concept of the commoners making it. Well, here it's a bit the same thing. The Bulgars, even though they were a nomadic people, knew perfectly well what infantry potential really was. Nomadic peoples have to fight sedentary people, right? As we were saying before, these Bulgars weren't coming out of nowhere. They perfectly knew what was out there. They had been serving, in this case, we're talking about Western Eurasian Byzantine armies, really in Persia. But things can get more distant, really, and quickly. But the steppes, too, do actually have infantry. This is yet another overlooked aspect, right? Not everybody in the steppes fights on horseback. Yes, prevalently, that's actually an area which cavalry is already decisive. Within it, you see, they weren't decisive against sedentary civilizations that were still based. Well, at this point, at least cavalry was not decisive. Well, it was the prevalent arm, but at least in antiquity it had been decisive. In an absolute sense, in early medieval times, essentially it's cavalry first and infantry later, but the latter can still beat cavalry in some moments. It's just between the mid 12th and the beginning of early 14th century that cavalry in the West is truly decisive, meaning that you don't find infantrymen in open field that beat cavalry alone, right? They always have other cavalry. They can resist, they can do lots of stuff, but they're not decisive per se, right? So the Bulgars, of course, knew pretty darn well what the Slavic military potential was. Again, the Slavs themselves had their own cavalry. They knew how to train their own troops. But in the moment in which these populations are taken over by the Bulgars, de facto, these guys, of course, inject this much more ferocious militarism, and they're not tender, as we were saying before. So you can imagine also how harshly would train these troops that, of course, had their own limits, because the same Bulgars do not have, say, the discipline overall as a civilization to confer to their forces as the Byzantines could have. That is always like the gold standard for these peoples. But indeed, there is some improvement and evolution in this. There is a military hierarchy, some ranks that we can identify in the Bulgarian army. Essentially, the army was entrusted to an officer called the Kavkan, when the Khan himself was not commanding it. In fact, the Kavkan was the second in command, and he was not just a military rank, right? Given that there was actually no difference, at least initially, even from a practical point of view, between the the people in the military, right? These were peoples in arms. Then eventually they began to feudalize, and so even though there was no difference between military and civilian, because the concept of civilian did not quite exist, at least there was an idea of who bore arms and who was under. That was the sort of more traditionally case-like division, right? So the Kavkan was probably the second most important person in the Bulgarian Empire after the ruler himself, all right? He also had his say in the international arena, diplomatically speaking. He was a member of the Boyar Council that we'll see in a while. He was, of course, a broader counselor for the emperor, and in Vuz's behalf, he would act, for example, as his regent or co-ruler, right? So when the Khan was not in the Bulgarian capital, the Cav Khan would govern in his stead. He had some judicial functions as well. So broader and not necessarily and fully institutionalized functions in a statal sense, but still evidently a position of enormous power. Only by the 11th century, so the end of the First Bulgarian Empire, you find two Kavkans, a split of the office between two, which is not even necessarily a matter of institutionalization, but reflecting rather the general decline and difficulty, in fact, of keeping the state together, considering the increased privatization, the centralization of power. Like overall, the Bulgarian state did not manage to get past the limit of, let's say that ethnic structure that had, again, been based on a step model, right, of government. The idea that the nobility is decentralized in response to the Khan because of the raiding purpose, like the Byzantines at the end of the day. The same Tsars had tried to surpass that by territorializing, but the nobility had been too strong, and the Byzantines ultimately managed to take over because of this inherent contrasts and the lack of an actual state that could counter them, because they were the state, and the Byzantine Empire was, in fact, reactivating on a very different basis of the Bulgarian Empire after, let's say, the pretty heavy issues of the previous centuries, to which the Bulgars, by the way, had dramatically contributed. We made lots of videos observing that sort of this constantly. You understand why Basil II eventually took kind of massacre, those incredibly long, like decades-long wars against them, because that was the problem from the other side. Like while the Bulgarians did not have that enormous power concentration in a state-like fashion like the Byzantines, still they inhabited a Balkan hinterland that was nightmarish to venture in from, in fact, the Byzantine side, and you had to dislodge, like, clan by clan, destroying all the fortresses and, suffering this ambushes, this reverses. It was an extremely bloody thing. I made a video about the cost-benefit ratio of Basil II's expansion in the first place. But at the end of the day, yes, he really did eliminate the Bulgarian threat. The Bulgarians essentially became a subject people that could not quite recompact as before. And in spite of their decentralization, they sort of remained under until the 12th century when, well, the empire was, the Byzantine Empire was about to fall apart towards the end. Then we know of, and about this, honestly, I'm not fully sure, that the Tarkan. Like, Tarkan is a term possibly coming from Iranian warfare rather than Turkic one. I couldn't really find a direct reference to Tarkans in the actual Bulgar sources of this period, but I can be wrong. In any case, the function of the Tarkant elsewhere in among other Turkic people, because the name is the same for other peoples, was similar to the one of a basically of a general of some sort, like a Byzantine strategos, for example. Then you had other officers like the Kalutarkans and Buliastarkans, right? That were thus, subspecies of the same. So there was under these essentially appointed commanders, or at least commanders that would take matters in their own hands and receive sort of the blessing of the Khan, the broader, lesser nobility. There were the boyars and the bagators. The difference between the two stands practically just in the etymology, because one is Slavic and the other is Turkic. Right? Boyar stems from bol, which means great, and sort of identified the aristocracy, the cream of Slavic society, and these were essentially the equivalent of the Western milites in Latin, right? And they, in fact, constituted the bulk, really, of the Bulgarian army. Bagatur is the equivalent in Turco-Mongolian languages. He means hero, valiant warrior, so it's basically the same exaltation concept because of this guy's deed and self-sacrifice in holy combat, in transcendental capacity, in fact in this sacred war. This individual nobleman at times did receive some, there was a hierarchy also within them, and for which they would receive some commands, even of field armies. For example, a boyar in 773 was entrusted with the command of 12,000 men in the Bulgarian army, which is, of course, also a mean, as you understand, for the Khan to work like, as encumbrant the Bulgar nobility would be because of the originary stock of the power of the clans. Co-opting, especially Slavic commanders, was a way to sort of gain the favor of the substratum and to counter, in fact, the role of the ethnic nobility, right? There were allegedly, so we have this Tarkan figure apparently documented for the mid-9th century, but I should check the reference because I'm not fully convinced. And apparently there were 10 of them, which would have been would have made a total of 100,000 men. So these guys commanded allegedly 10,000 men each. So again, these were true generals, like commanding chunks of the thirds of the imperial army, right? So they commanded single battles, and they had an important degree of strategic and tactical autonomy, because of course 100,000 men and the 10 Tarkans here sound, just because of the circle and the amount of troops, like of course an ideal. Of course there would have been 100,000 men eligible for military service in the first of the Bulgarian Empire, but mobilizing them was completely beyond any capacity of any power. The idea is that the Tarkan would have been, or his equivalent, because there were these officers of these levels for sure, sort of a provincial commander of sort. And you understand why also these troops could not be mobilized, because of course this provincial dimension equated to a, say, major chunk of the country that is largely on its own. It would respond to the Khan call, but mostly at a top level. Like saying, if this 10 Tarkans were to be mobilized, or even just 3 were mobilized, say, you would have 30,000 men. But it was easier just to mobilize from the entire system if at least these various chunks were loyal, in having less troops, so you could put them together from different other places, different places at a time. We'll see now there were some auxiliaries coming from the steppes as well. This is quite typical also of Magyar history in Europe, to just call the new fresh savage from the steppe that you can use to actually counter the ethnic nobility locally, settling them, especially on the frontier in the northeast, creating some sort of buffer clientele to stem other nomadic groups, right? Because the better lands are in the south, and that's where the Bulgars are settled. So it's always the same dynamic. These guys know how it works. They maintain quite long-range connections with these other steppe peoples. That's again why we have to talk a bit more about them. And so, but here, at least as far as the Tarkans are considered, the 10 to 100,000 is of course the decimal ideal of the steppes, and it surely corresponded to some sort of military organization, but it was mostly based politically on the provincial availability, as you understand. None of this had to do with permanent troops, because as we'll see now, just the nobility had de facto some permanent forces that were the ones that the rest of the population worked for, and that habitually were involved in politics, in warfare on a large scale. You had, for example, the Khan's retinue, known in Greek, because of course the Byzantine influence was very strong, as treptoi anthropoi, which means properly the kept men. They, together with the retinues of the nobility, constituted the only de facto standing army. This is a concept I was discussing the other day when I made that video about the first permanent nucleus of the French Royal Army in the 14th century. I mean, there had always been standing armies, right? Because virtually all these professionals that you keep in your household, like you maintain, think about the huskarls, you have them everywhere, the masnatai. Those are just permanent. They're professional troops, right? They kill people as a living, just since they're trained as that, and they will likely end their life doing that. And these were the guys that ruled over the others, also locally, the wide extent of peasants, but also maintaining in their own land, but also maintaining this raiding customs for which they could, invade other areas. Think about when the Carolingians crushed the Avars and how, this opened this enormous frontier between the Franks and the Bulgarians, and they could raid in between. We saw recently in the video about early medieval Serbia how, of course, the Bulgarians wanted to, they periodically would force neighboring peoples into subjection. And so it was just an escape route that just for even supplying these forces. You launch a good raid into the Aegean, you can plunder pretty rich territories. That when there is the umpteenth Byzantine crisis on the imperial throne, Roman forces clashing against one another, first thing that happens is these valleys, these Balkan valleys, get filled with all these raiders, and they sack as much as they can, and they come back home, and you see you can't quite easily even control them as a Khan, right? So that retaliation becomes difficult for the Byzantines that have to go out. Of course, the Khans would fuel these things because they would act deliberately in that matter. Of course, it was a matter of mobilizing their own, imperial force to give, just to participate, to push on the Byzantine system, hoping to crush it and to finally take it over. They fail, but they still cause damage. They destructure a great part of this Balkan hinterland. They also, because the Byzantines retaliate, so there is all a frontier that, as we've seen, the Balkan hinterland is not particularly florid by itself, and it is a frontier. It is always a frontier at this point, from this point onwards. And there is all, especially a Western dimension in the Balkans that not even the Khans could quite control easily, and it's also in fact more distant from Constantinople. The center of Bulgarian power was shifted in fact towards the southeast because it was closer to Constantinople. They could get more from it, and they could also threaten more easily the enemy capital. But the Theodosian walls would keep on working for quite a long time, as you know. So this was the general strategy involved, right? There was, speaking of these kept men, let's say, they were maintained and paid even in peacetime, meaning that they were just equipped, nourished by their own masters, as these guys were literally the medium through which their lords could maintain power. They would sack, they would loot, they would just be given certain amounts of cannons. They had lands that, of course, were also betting on their lords' success, like to hopefully having reinvest, as it would happen. The system worked like that. That gain into their own territory. Next to this de facto professional force that was the backbone of the Bulgarian army qualitatively, you have the general levy. That is still out there. Of course, every true Bulgar freeman was a warrior. This was the deal of the conqueror, and the reason why they existed as a people in the first place. Plus, there was also the idea of Slavic freedom, just like it would be, I don't know, in the Romano-Germanic world. It was pretty much standard, and even though, again, there were these very heavy social divides, you see in Western Europe, you have literal classes that you can distinguish on the basis of the mansi, of their income. We made multiple videos about the Carolingian or the Longobard or the Anglo-Saxon. The Anglo-Saxon a bit less in that regard, but also they were evolving over time. Sort of important level of social control and wealth, right? That was a criterion for the levy. In the Balkans, this criterion was largely based on just practical relations of power of some sort. I mean, there wasn't really a state fully distinguishing between households and, keeping records. Of course, it was an attempt to do so to some extent, but again, the system was run very privately, and so if you were an average, say, Bulgarian peasant and your lord told you to go to war for him, you would have to do that, right? He had to be careful not to annoy you too much, to oppress you too much, because you could even rebel, and these things were really frequent. The Slavs, to some extent, also in the early days, had kept an important degree of even political autonomy in many communities, etc. But let's say you would have been the first one not caring absolutely anything about somebody else's freedom. You would have had slaves on your own. You would have surely taken them from your neighborhood if that was the chance, right? It wasn't of a civil state authority that dispensed law and justice and profusely, like in a like, for example, in the West, or even to some extent in the Byzantine Empire. Everything was blurred in early medieval times in all these countries, but the Balkans are definitely wilder, and so you find a bit less of a regulated military system, except everything was clear when the broader society needed to mobilize and to which extent, right? And a reason for a very powerful indicator of this informal system is the fact that the general levy was unpaid, right? You were forced to be mobilized, and your only incentive was plunder. as we were saying before, basically the entire Bulgarian strategy as far as the regular relation with the Byzantines were concerned. Let's go right into that valley. Yes. And so if you were capable of doing so, and if you were armed, if you had this privilege of being maybe not as powerful as the Bulgarian, let's say the Bulgar lord living nearby, but still having, your own means, maybe even a horse, and being of help in those kind of expeditions, well, you could maybe bring back a slave or some gold, or some cattle, and it was perfectly fine, and it would work like that. Then there was, in this sense, also all a regulation, for example, of how to divide the spoils of war, which was a very important issue among even some more advanced cultures, because at the end of the day, loot was pretty much for pre-industrial societies a very important source of income. A crucially motivating factor, because at the end of the day, the Byzantine Empire would come back. It was a much more stable system than at least the broader political and societal one, especially in these more decentralized places of the Bulgarian Empire, which meant that there would have been, first of all, some sort of retaliation. It was also pretty dangerous for the stability of these places that were still living in that kind of predatory mindset, exactly because they were desperate in their own abode, right? It wasn't a comfortable position to having to even carry out these expeditions, these raids, to survive, like in their local struggle, etc. And the reactivational capacity, the coming back capacity of the Byzantines was much stronger. So the typical, lesser civilizational thing, grab as much as you can immediately. Who cares about the boat that is sinking overall? Just make damage and think about yourself in the short term. And in fact, guess who wins in the end? About sizes, we observed how 20,000-30,000 men was sort of the average of the Danubian Bulgarian field armies. The famous Khan Krum, for instance, had 30,000 men in 813. Again, pretty average for the logistical, strategical capacities of the time. 30,000 men is okay, especially considering that there are lots of horses in Bulgarian armies. This is already a gigantic effort, actually. Sources say that these troops, by the way, were all armored, and some think that even they were just prevalently made of horsemen. Armored is a big word. It can be anything. It can be even padded armor, some minimal, like a helmet or whatever. They probably weren't that affluent in material culture, all right? And the greater this is the case, the more it's like, say, the percentage of mounted troops increases. Again, this people was pretty similar to the ones northeast in the neighboring steppe to some extent. Also because, as we'll see now, many of these men were not even technically Bulgarians. They were, again, auxiliaries from the steppes that were used as cannon fodder, arrow fodder, if you prefer. The idea of them being all mounted does make sense only in that case, especially considering, again, the raiding predatory nature of these populations. They could even march from substantially far away, raiding, maybe wintering within the Byzantine Empire in a time which the empire was crippled because of internal strife or whatever. They couldn't put together an army. If you study the Bulgarian Byzantine wars, they're always like that. This constant back and forth of incredibly messy, complicated, chaotic situation on the frontier, and with lots of, phase changing, side switching, and it's the same reason why there are all these horsemen around. I mean, the region had always been like that. The steppe peoples had always exploited the local crisis in the Senator war to profit from that, to side with this or that, plundering, raiding, getting away, right? Not involving themselves in siege warfare and pitched battle. They preferred just to harass the enemy. Of course, there was some capacity of retaining these forces together in the eventuality of sieges and major confrontations. But there was an inherent difference in the different chunks of the army, their quality, in their motivation, in their background, their extraction. You find Slavs, Avars, onagers. You have really many adventurers participating, even from more sedentary places. We know that 32,000 Bulgarians faced a Russian attack in 967. And these numbers, again, are all normal. What really matters is also how were they segmented internally. And very often we do not know that. Right, tactically speaking, we have a general idea. We can get a hint, a detail, but we rarely have for the single number that is given by a chronicle. Maybe, I don't know, 200 years later, about that battle, like what was the composition. We can't just typically imagine that on the basis of the troop types, the iconography, and that's why we need to make the military historical units kind of videos, because that tells you like more or less concretely what these guys were about. Also, in terms of material culture and panoply. Against the Magyars, the Bulgarians suffered in 896 ruinous loss of 20,000 casualties, which, however, seems to have included the Pecheneg auxiliary forces, in fact, from the Bulgarian side. The Magyars, by the way, would have looked not that particularly different from these forces, right? There were the Pechenegs, in fact. Maybe the Bulgarians had a pinch more of, sedentary Slavic element, but also what appears from the operational and strategical history of these campaigns is that the relative ease in mobility seems to have been due to the capacity, again, of that professional component of Bulgarian military and society to be supplied by the rest of the population. So you had basically most of this, again, mounted armies going around, knowing where they could forage, how much support they could have, or what land they could plunder, whatever. And so, even though there was surely an important infantry capacity of mobilization and also speed, like it's really a myth that cavalry armies as such are speedier than infantry ones. You always have both, actually, in these armies. You have wagons, they all knew how to move. They all knew how to react to these, how to exploit the terrain, to passes, river fordings, marches, etc. You find really also a lot of siege warfare because of that, because you have lots of siege warfare for those places' standards, because of course there weren't massive fortifications or structures along the frontier. But if you have an avampost surrounded by marshes, you can sort of hold it with a significant end of, for example, wearing the enemy out, or trying to outflank and cut him off from his supply lines and all this stuff. So the thing is still done overwhelmingly by movement, maneuver, and so lighter troops, cavalry, etc. But it's also about living in this terrifying environment that you can imagine, like in the high Middle Ages, places like Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, Ukraine, like how they could be, right? it's really fascinating just to imagine looking at the landscapes now. I would like to conclude this video talking about the Great Fence, right? This earthwork defense line, also known as Erkesia, along the Byzantine-Bulgarian border. Likely erected in the early 9th century, essentially as the result of the state border settlement between Bulgaria and the Byzantines, established by the peace treaty between Khan Omurtag and Emperor Leo V, the Armenian, in 815 or 16. That's the most likely date. But just like for the Danubian or Offa's Dyke, actually, these infrastructures were often present from centuries. Right, Offa's Dyke is something existing from Roman times. The Danubian is also very much older than what's usually credited. Here it's a bit the same thing, right? It was the largest and most famous defensive fortification south of the Danube, so a territory that had belonged to the Roman Empire for a consistent time, and it stretched from the Black Sea coast to the Maritsa River valley, which was quite strategic because it blocked, right, an important passage, right, from north to south. It consisted of a construction of a ditch on the southern side and an embankment on the northern one with a total length of 142 kilometers and a maximum width of 22 meters. It's actually a massive work that shows, in fact, the best of the First Bulgarian Empire sedentary potential. It served both military defense as well as an organized customs border, right? It had settlements, right? It facilitated trade and cultural exchanges with Constantinople, and it would last meaningfully until the 14th century, when the Ottomans took over, for the record. And today it's also like an important cultural monument of national significance, and the legend goes that the construction of this fence would have been ordered by Khan Krum to mobilize the entire able-bodied population from the surrounding villages to build it. And while, again, probably Krum had not necessarily made the thing for what it really already was, the mobilization necessary to erect this fence did involve much more than the surrounding villages. Like, it was a massive effort from the entire empire. It was like wanted, of course, dirigistically by the Bulgarian imperial power. It concentrated enormous resources, highlighting what we were saying before regarding the fact that for how much the Bulgarians could raid into the Byzantine Empire, this was mostly an act of desperation that could have seen them victorious in the longer run, but in a struggle in which the guy who punched the hardest was Constantinople. There was just a bigger, more powerful system, and very often could even neglect the Bulgarian frontier because it was always unstable to an extent, to the point that it was not even much of a surprise about that. The Bulgarians could concentrate important strategic forces, but it was not too frequent. Like, most of it was just skirmishes. Generally speaking, when the enemy is preparing something big in the first place, from many indicators. Also in the past, without satellites or whatever. Actually, this place with all the merchants, the customs, like the communities revolving around it because of trade, was just a place from which news would arrive on both sides, and it mostly had the function of slowing down a Byzantine onslaught, and generally speaking, showing that the defensive, where the strongest side was, where the defensive side had to build, right? And this highlights pretty well like the political and strategic balance between the Bulgarians and Constantinople. And if you think about the garrisoning of it, that surely was entrusted to the local communities, the upkeeping cost as well that had not to be indifferent. You realize also how the Bulgarian Empire was heading towards some greater, territorialization, which was eventually cut short by the Byzantine destruction, even though the system was mostly feudalizing and so on. Again, not particularly towards a particularly solid statal direction, but obviously one that if the Byzantines had given way in a way or another, they risked that anyway. Would have seen a Bulgarian Empire, of course, at that point taking over Constantinople and whatever, changing like the entire internal power dynamics, whatever. But of course, capitalizing, actually having the resources to create for it. It's a bit like the Serbians later on, right before the Ottomans arrived. They were not a particularly stable system. They just exploited other people, the neighbors' weakness. They had something they had to say as a people, but eventually their national history was essentially erased. Their national potential was thwarted by the Ottoman invasion. That, in that sense, was providing with at least a much more coherently functional system than these guys were presenting. Otherwise, the Balkans would have won, right? Rather the West at that point that could save the Balkans, and it was even about to do so. If after Belgrade all the protagonists of the crusade had not died of plague, like Constantinople could be taken over by the Crusaders. Like, there was nothing deterministic about the, in fact, allegedly unstoppable Ottoman rise. It was actually a much more fragile system by that point than we can imagine. But surely the Balkans had been historically damaged by all this chronic instability. We've seen how literally the Bulgarians themselves destroyed under Tsar Simeon the early medieval Serbian principality. I mean, they literally razed it. And so they had sort of rebuilt from scratch this statal experiment. So I can't stress enough the degree of shocking brutality that especially Balkan warfare, like a bit all like Southern European ones, but the cruelty and the darkness of Balkan relations in this conflict, it's something appalling. It's something incredible, right? Again, the Iberian or the Italian peninsula can be tough as grounds, but they sort of have a civilization that to an important degree, in some cases, by the way, but and they have a quite high intense warfare. But them, the Balkans are, it's total misery, total violence, total bloodshed, total destruction, total. Again, you wake up one morning and you have the umpteenth, nomadic war band coming to slaughter and rape and burn alive, basically, everything they find. It's not that there is much of a difference in the head of a Kuman between a cow, a child, and or a dog. Like, it's everything does, like in terms of eating, raping, whatever. It's essentially what these people are exclusively are, right? And that's something which we tend to forget when it comes to dividing civilization within the same Europe and understanding what, let's say, the impact that steppes peoples had, generally speaking, in the development of European divide the way they are today, right? I could digress, but this is not so important. In any case, I have a playlist about medieval Bulgaria. I'm glad that we are covering a bit more of its history, and again, with time, if God wants, like, everything gets done. And perseverance, patience, going step by step, I think, are some of the most precious ingredients in someone's life, and as long as you know what you want and you know how to achieve that. And here we're doing something. I would say things go the way they must, after all, as always. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me, wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.